Hello. Thank you everyone for joining. We are still waiting for a few people, especially those who are just finished with our lesson. Jadi for fun fact, kami barusan selesai les di kelas jam 10.30 sampai jam 12, makanya ini anak-anaknya masih di luar dan mereka akan join juga di Zoom ini sebentar lagi ketika mereka dijemput. So while waiting, can I have a conversation with Mika dan also Fatih? Boleh kita ngobrol-ngobrol sedikit sebelum teman-teman yang lain join di Zoom-nya? Kalau bisa open mic, that would be great. Tapi kalau nggak bisa, please type down kalian dari mana. Sekarang lagi di mana? Ya.
Saya dari Surabaya. Lagi ingin join Zoom ini. Kayaknya menarik nih semua ini.
Dari mana tahu info tentang town hall hari ini?
Ya kebetulan ada teman saya yang nge-share tentang Cogito Academy, jadi ya
Menarik.
dan dia ternyata ngajar juga ternyata di Cogito, jadi ya udah akhirnya join Zoom juga gitu. Tapi
Kalau boleh
bukan
tahu
yang
siapa yang jadi temanmu? Dia?
kebetulan
Khairul?
ada apa?
Siapa
Yang
temanmu
dari
yang
Surabaya,
ngajar?
dari Surabaya kebetulan. Namanya Mas Koirul namanya.
Oh,
Koirul Anam. Ya.
oh, ya. Keren-keren. Thank you.
Iya.
Oke. Mika lagi di mana, Mika?
Lagi di rumah ini, Kak.
Oh, di rumah. Nice. Thank you for
Di
making
Malang.
it on time. Sudah pernah riset belum? Ini pembicaranya siapa sih?
Jujur belum sih, Kak.
Oke, belum ya. Kalau Fatih sudah tahu belum
Hmm.
pembicara hari ini siapa?
Ya, juara MUN ya kalau nggak salah.
Betul. Bukan MUN aja, tapi juga debat, bahkan spesialisasinya di debat. Aku izin introduce dulu ya, saat kita menunggu kehadiran Leslie. Jadi teman-teman perkenalkan, aku Ezer, Head of Education dari Cogito Academy, dan aku akan jadi MC untuk acara hari ini. Aku mau kenalin teman-teman sama dua pembicara keren yang bakal, aku akan kenalin teman-teman sama pembicara keren yang bakal berbagi ke teman-teman sekalian. Yaitu Leslie Diana Torres adalah seorang debate and moot court champion, sudah berulang kali ikut lomba dan menang. Pernah berkesempatan untuk menjadi konsultan di UN OHCHR, ini ngomongin human rights, dan juga menjadi legal intern di UNRWA ngomongin Palestine. Jadi kalau kita di Indonesia sering Free Palestine, Free Palestine, nah dia nggak cuma ngomong, dia actually do the work di kantor PBB, dia memperjuangkan hak-hak Palestina. Apa yang mau dibagikan hari ini, kita bisa lihat di sini, Kak Leslie ini sudah berulang kali ikut lomba, tapi ternyata kalau ditelisik lebih dalam, sebenarnya dia ini orang yang pendiam. Sebenarnya orang yang tidak nyaman berada di kerumunan. Nah, tapi kenapa bisa jadi juara lomba debat? Padahal introvert. Kan orang Indonesia sering pakai alasan, aku introvert, aku nggak bisa ngomong di depan umum. Oh, jangan salah. Ini adalah bukti introvert bisa nggak cuma pinter ngomong, juara dunia bahkan. Nah, nanti teman-teman bisa tanya sama Leslie, how her upbringing, bagaimana di masa-masa SMA, SMP mungkin malu, kenapa akhirnya dia bisa ikut lomba debat, teman-teman boleh banget tanya sama Leslie. Nah, yang jelas semuanya butuh practice and intense studying, jadi nggak bisa nggak latihan. Maka dari itu, sesi with Leslie will talk about how she practice and also study to upgrade her skills as someone who speak in front of the public. And how has debating shaped her as a person? Later, you will hear from herself, from Leslie herself, how many professional opportunities are interested to her because she has acquired the necessary skills to perform in the professional opportunities that she is doing. And that's it. I think Leslie is also here. So nanti later we'll talk to Leslie even more. But I want to hear from Mika. What do you think about her profile? Nih langsung ngomongnya di depan orangnya nggak apa-apa. Mika, can you share what you think of our speaker today?
Jujur aku speechless. Aku
Speechless?
merasa terinspirasi. I felt
Okay.
inspired and I want to be like her. Aku mau jadi debater sekeren beliau dan aku ingin mengikuti jejak-jejaknya dan aku ingin menjadikan dia sebagai modelku.
Ooh,
Respect.
such an honor. Thank you, Mika, for sharing your thoughts. Yeah. Oh, Leslie is excited to share her story with you later. Fatih, can we hear from you as well? Bagaimana pendapat Fatih?
Ya, jadi backgroundnya sih ya, Kak
Mhm.
Leslie Diane Torres ini appreciate banget sih buat beliau karena menyuarakan hak-hak orang-orang yang termarginalkan gitu kan. Karena nggak semua orang tuh bisa menyuarakan hak-hak orang-orang yang termarginalkan gitu. Apalagi di UN juga.
Ya.
Jadi aku itu prestasi yang benar-benar hebat dan bisa ditingkatkan lagi sih. Bisa
Oh,
dipertahankan, sorry. Luar biasa sih emang Kak Leslie, keren.
friend. So yeah, later we'll have the conversation with you, Leslie. But our audience today, Fatih and Mika, already said that you are so inspiring, you are so cool. So we're excited to hear from you yourself, like how the story in details. And here's the thing, guys, because we are still waiting for people to join. Fatih and Mika, we want you to prepare questions because today's conversation is not going to be meaningful without your questions. So you can type it down on your phone or on your gadget or write down on your book what questions you want to ask Leslie specifically, because this chance doesn't come every day. We only invite Leslie once a year because next month we'll have another speaker, but talking directly to Leslie is a very rare opportunity that you need to treasure. So we want to make sure that Mika and Fatih make the most of this opportunity. Well, we also want to remind our audience who hasn't participated in the Zoom, who hasn't joined, to also enter the room. Allow me to open my phone and text our audiences who have confirmed their attendance. So see you at 12:30. Later, we will start at 12:30 to actually officially commence this session. Enjoy the brainstorming time, guys. Hello everyone. Thank you for joining this event. And on my hand is the certificate from the Hague Academy of International Law, where here you can read. Wait, the virtual background actually doesn't allow me to show you this. Still blurry. Sorry, guys. Okay, as you can see here, Rafsi Albar is one team with Leslie Diana Torres, where they became the second runner-up best written advice, and also runner-up best initial statement. Let me show you the certificate. Yep, best initial statement, runner-up, and also best negotiation. They compete in one event. It's called Day of Crisis, where they use their public speaking skills to convince people about what they believe related to international law. And today, we are going to be graced by Leslie herself to share her insights from day one, how her journey went from high school student, become a public speaker, become a world-class debater, and now we can call her a world-class scholar champion. So we're very thankful for your presence here, Leslie, and we are not alone because Rafsi, her teammate, is also here. So I'll pass this screen to Rafsi so that he can moderate the session. And guys, if you have any question, feel free to ask. Rafsi, please.
All right,
Enjoy.
thank you, Azhar, and thank you, Leslie, for making it time to have this chat with us today. Of course, this is a great pleasure to have you, and I think just as a disclaimer for everyone, the session will be conducted mostly in English. If there are any insights that I think would be relevant to translate into Bahasa Indonesia, of course, I will do that. But of course, because Leslie doesn't speak Bahasa, at least more than terima kasih, we are going to host this event in English. So Leslie, welcome to Cogito Monthly Town Hall. This is the first of our monthly town halls. So these are among the first people within our community, aside from, of course, some of the other students who are either still on their way or are not able to join because of school, because as we know, most of them are in high school. So that's the purpose of the recording. This recording will be shared among our students so that they're able to take the lessons regardless of their ability to come this afternoon with you today. So as an introduction for everyone, Leslie is a very close friend of mine, especially when it comes to looking for Asian food in Geneva. So we studied at the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, from which we just graduated. Hooray! And Leslie has been a debater slash moot court champion since a long time ago. And she's here to share with us, especially how the journey started and how potentially everyone here can take inspiration in terms of how this can lead to a certain path. In this case, for example, a career in international law. So Leslie, without further ado, I think I would like to provide this opportunity to ask a very general question as an introductory question. How did your journey in debating slash moot court started? Like, did it start in high school? And then how was the first days of doing debate?
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm just trying to check if I'm audible. Like, you can hear me, right? Okay, that's good. So, hi, my name is Leslie. I actually started as young as in high school, I think. Yeah, definitely in high school I started, but a lot of people now, they start much earlier. So I know that they start as early as like grade school, elementary years, and then it starts getting more competitive afterwards. But I started a bit late. I started at the end of high school and then progressed to collegiate debating. We do moot court competitions. I'm not sure. I think Indonesia has LLB, right? So I think in college you do moot already. But for example, in the Philippines, we can only join moot court competitions when we're in law school. And law for us is a postgraduate degree. So my transition was more in high school, I did debate. And then when I was in college, I did debate again, collegiate debating. And then when I went to law school, I did moot because you kind of graduate as well from the opportunities in life. And so we started with public speaking, but even then I started public speaking much earlier in life. I did oratorical competitions, I did extemporaneous competitions when I was much younger as well. So I would say that the training was always very different, and in a way it was quite, I would say, transformative through the years. It was very different in a sense where you learn how to do public speaking first. So you kind of overcome the fear of a crowd, and then you change into the platforms and the fora afterwards. And the subject matter also changes over time. So I think that's how I really started quite young. Yeah.
And just to give a context for everyone here, what different kinds of debating are there, like from high school and then college and then in law school?
Okay, so in competitions, for example, we have usually you stick with your cohort, right? So you do high school debating and you do a lot of high school competitions. So you do nationals, Asian schools, world schools, and these are like levels that increase over time. So you not only start within your region, you get more competitive as you go. So a lot of times you do that. But there are also competitions wherein high school students can mix with collegiate debaters. We call them open competitions. And that's when you get to compete against other people who are much older than you. And you really test your skills as to whether or not you can do arguments. And I would say that a lot of high school debaters are actually very brilliant. They tend to do really well, even in open competitions. So that's a great thing. And I think because you get to fight against people who are much older, they have a very different view of life. Their way of thinking and way of argumentation is very different as well. That's going to be very helpful. So that's a level of like being able to mix with a particular cohort. And then there's collegiate debating as well, where essentially the schools that can compete are only from universities or colleges. And so those are the people that you go up against with, and then you create this whole community around collegiate debaters. So
And do you think what has changed in terms of like the difficulty, or the substance between the high school level, university, and then more specifically law debate?
I think it changes over time in a sense where obviously when you're doing it for a much younger age, at a much younger age, and the conversations and the topics are less complicated. So it's usually just going to discuss things that are logical or policies that aren't exactly going to be intertwined with a lot of other sectors. But when you get to the collegiate level, it then changes very much because then you talk about more real world examples, and the level and the rigor at which you're expected to argue is also going to be different. So then it's going to be harder. And I think because you're competing against people who have very different backgrounds, then the expectation of you from you to learn how to argue against individuals who know a much more specific topic and perhaps know much more on the issue than you do is then going to be higher as well. So then the requirement for being well read, for example, then increases over time. And I think the complexity is shown because of that.
Okay, that's nice. Now we talked about the difference, but I want to know like what is consistent in terms of, let's say, a skill that you think has been developed through debating and you think is most relevant in any kind of debate, regardless of the format.
I think regardless of format, it's the ability to actually converse and to think on your feet and really just be analytical about things, to not take things basically on face value, and to always just be critical about what is being said to you. In a way, I think that's a bit off because then you start questioning way too many things, and that becomes the default, which how you imagine or envision things. But I always think that sort of helped me over time. And as I grew as well, it just became so much better because then when you become a bit more critical of things, you try to understand also perspectives from the way different people see them. So it's not just that you're trying to hear things and then you're trying to argue against it, but you're trying to also understand why people think that way. And I think that's also a very important skill that you learn over time.
Interesting. Now let me just quickly translate that the excerpt of everything for our friends here. Jadi teman-teman, kalau dari Leslie sendiri, satu hal yang mungkin konsisten dari bagaimana debat itu ketika awal mulai di sekolah SMA gitu ya, sampai akhirnya kuliah, dan kalau misalkan di Philippines dan banyak negara lainnya itu kan antara kuliah S1 dengan kuliah hukum itu berbeda. Jadi ya, kuliah hukum itu harus kelas 1 adalah bagaimana yang ada perubahan adalah sophistication, tingkat kesusahan dari topik yang dibahas, tapi yang tetap sama adalah bagaimana kita bisa berbincang, berinteraksi dengan suatu topik, bukan hanya untuk kita kritis terhadap topik itu, tapi juga untuk mengerti, paham, sehingga kita bisa betul-betul membuat argumen yang kuat dari sana. Nah, Leslie, when it comes to, I think you mentioned two things that are interesting there, the ability to converse and the ability to think critically, right? I'm quite curious as to like, if there's one habit that anyone who wants to enter debating has to start, or, be it reading, writing, or anything, what would that, small change in their life could be to become a good debater later on?
I think definitely reading the news. It's not something I do personally, but I wish other people. I wish I did it better, but definitely people reading the news. I realize that when people understand the world a lot more, then they can try to make arguments from it and try to make sense of things more as well. But even if, say, you don't like reading the news, then what I would recommend is that you talk to as many people as possible and see people from different walks of life, because then you're not really just basing it off what you see in the news, but what you learn and what you understand of people and how their day-to-day lives work. So for me, that was my alternative, because I don't like reading the news, but I like talking to people. I like understanding stories, and I like knowing their backgrounds. And I think that the more you understand these things, then the more different your mindset is, because then you can imagine what it's like to be in their shoes. Obviously, it's not as good and it's not going to be as accurate as what they're going through. But I think being able to sort of picture out what it looks like on the ground then helps you try to make sense of things. And I think also because the more you talk to different people, and I think it's very important not to stay within your circles anyway, regardless of what you do in life. But I think talking to other people and understanding their stories also means that you are able to try to practice how you can explain and tell stories yourself that would be understandable to not just one group of people. And I think that's very important, learning how to speak to people and be understood by people of different walks of life.
That is interesting, because my next question was about how would you adjust your language, like your tone, especially like now that you mentioned about talking to different kinds of people and trying to adjust your language to these people. How from that, like your day-to-day practice, do you translate that into, the kind of language you use when debating?
Okay, so debating actually is very argumentative. I'm not sure if the students here have seen videos, but people are usually angry when or they sound very angry. They sound very like they're like almost out of breath because they talk for 7 minutes, and it's 7 minutes and it's very fast, and you try to make all these arguments. But in real life, you don't talk like that, right? And honestly, I would say be very careful if you're starting out as a debater. What I noticed, because you do that for years, like you do that for at least 5-10 years of your life if you study so much and you start very early. So you pick up a lot of things, and you pick up a certain way of speaking, for example, that I would say is not necessarily a good thing. So it's good to learn how to argue. It's good how to speak well in front of a crowd and not be intimidated by any person that you see. That's a good thing. But then if you listen to mannerisms and you pick up mannerisms and not let go of them because you're very intent on debating just well, and then essentially when you get to like boardrooms, for example, or when you're pitching before a boss, then you start to sound very argumentative even when you're not trying. So that's, I think, one of the things that you have to be careful about. And I think so that's important because when you start, for example, you need to be able to treat it as if you're telling a story each time. And then you read the room, right? Like you read the room, you understand who your judges are, and then you try to tell stories and you try to argue your way, but in a way it's not just like you're condescending or you're not trying to talk over someone, but you're trying to make sense of things and you're trying to explain why you're more sensible than other people in the room. But also, I think very importantly, I think what should be remembered is that when you give a speech, you only give a speech for 7 minutes. But then what happens in a full round, it lasts for about an hour. In a competition, for example, there are 4 to 5 rounds in a day. And that takes more effort and more time. Being able to converse, for example, with people who have very different opinions from you is one thing. And I think it's also the practice of debating, just like being in a room, completely disagreeing with each other, and then snapping out of it right after and just understanding that you still are friends. And I think that also breeds a sense of professionalism as you go. Like, we can agree to disagree and it's fine. And then afterwards, after a round, we can all just discuss on the merits of the argument as it is. And I think that helps you then sort of build this skill as well, where you're talking to different people and you know how to talk to them, because then you realize that there are different personas of you. There's a persona inside the room, there's a persona for when you talk to people or people that you don't necessarily like or you still disagree with because you're pissed at what happened during the round. And then there are people afterwards where you're just absolute friends. And I think that becomes the lesson on changing really tones in speaking.
Interesting, and I very much agree on that point, because it's hard, sometimes to differentiate or like snap out of the debating mode right after you go into the room. Like the whole purpose of you being in that room is to prove that your argument is better than the other person. But now, if we talk about and I think the first step to being able to deliver an argument is to be able to calm yourself. As I said, as you said, actually, not to run out of breath. Um, although that's sometimes the style that people take up in debating. But how do you try to, before you speak, how do you usually get in the zone, so to speak?
So I think people do it very differently. The way I do it, I have notes, but then I don't write on my notes. I actually make graphs and I make circles and I make patterns on my paper. So it's very, very personal. I think it changes from each person as well. So in my case, what I would usually do is I write. I always take a couple of seconds before I actually start any speech to just breathe. And I want to make sure that my voice is full every time I start talking. Rafi, you know this, but I actually sound very different when I talk to a friend versus like when I speak in public. Like there's a difference in my voice, like it changes. And I also try to do that. So like when I start, for example, speaking in any podium, I try to imagine what kind of voice I want to project. And then I think about it for a second, then I try to deliver. Obviously in rounds where it gets heated up, when people are trying to be very antagonistic with each other, you tend to speak a bit faster and you kind of lose your pace. But the good thing in debating, and it depends on the format that you use, but then it changes because there are like people who ask for points of information, for example, or there are times at which like it just gets really confusing, or in between breaks or in between arguments when you're about to transition from one argument to another. I would personally take them as posts from which I should breathe. So then, like, for example, I conclude, I take a bit of a breather, and then I go, okay, secondly, we move on to this. And then, so then I could keep my pacing, even if at some points I feel myself get derailed. I always make sure that at some point I get to a point where I can breathe and I speak slower, because I think it's very important to speak slow, even when people are just all agitated, because the slower you sound, like the slower you speak, not too intentionally, but like when you speak slower and there's a bit more conviction in how you speak, I think that also makes it, I would say, more believable, because then you speak with the sound of just like, I know what I'm talking about. And I think that's important.
That's very nice. I think one particular thing I like about what you just said is the fact that it's important to always keep yourself in check during your speech as you go with your arguments. So let me translate that again to the friends here in Bahasa, just to give an excerpt, because some of us are just joining now. So teman-teman yang barusan dikatakan Lesti adalah ada beberapa hal yang cukup menarik. Yang pertama adalah kalau mau kita memulai dalam dunia debat, cara pertama untuk menjadi orang yang bisa berargumen dengan baik adalah dengan membaca yang banyak atau juga dengan berbicara dengan banyak orang. Yang penting adalah bagaimana kita bisa berinteraksi dengan banyak informasi supaya kita bisa terlatih untuk berpikir secara kritis dari sana. Dan ketika kita nanti mau berargumen untuk melakukan debat, penting juga untuk bisa memastikan bahwa bahasa yang kita pakai itu tepat dan bagaimana pendekatannya itu bisa dikatakan terarah, gitu. Pendekatan yang baik, pendekatan yang dengan secara sengaja, kehati-hatian, kalian berbicara. Jadi salah satu contohnya adalah bagaimana kalian harus mulai dengan mengambil nafas yang panjang sebelum akhirnya mengatakan kata pertama dalam perdebatan, dan ketika kalian sedang membuat argumen itu tetap harus memastikan bahwa kalian tidak terlalu cepat dalam menyampaikan argumennya dan ambil pauses tertentu untuk bisa kalian berefleksi dan mulai ke argumen berikutnya. So, Leslie, the next part of this is a particular part of debating. At least, this can take up different forms, but is researching, right? Because it takes a good amount of research before being able to deliver a good argument. What is your go-to strategy when it comes to research? What do you try to find out first in order to lead you to other pieces of information that you later on use?
I remember when I was in college, I would have all these applications of news sites that I would just try to read. Naturally, they are going to be disjuncted. So the way with news is that obviously it assumes that you're following already what's happening. So when you're not reading the news and you see it for the first time, you're like, oh, I don't know what this is about. So then every time I do that, I make a list of topics that I don't understand, and then I read pieces on them, like news pieces that are more like editorials of sorts. The Economist was really very, very helpful for me growing up. I'm not sure if they're still on circulation, right? I think The Economist is still in circulation, but I really read The Economist. That was my best friend, and in college I was carrying The Economist because they had explained. There was always context and the way they would explain things, and so there's a lens at which you view things. And then when it's a bit interesting for me, I try to read more about it, but otherwise I just pick up from what The Economist says. What else is there? I think just reading from multiple sources as well was also quite important. But then just picking up which bits I needed for me to understand what was going on, and trying to make sure that I have a clearer picture of things, and to make sure that I wasn't reading from one source, because then I think things tend to be quite political, especially in the media. There are certain ways in which certain issues are going to be discussed and depicted. And I think that was very important as well. Knowing where you're reading it, knowing the quality of the news, knowing whether it's left wing or right wing what you're reading, I think was also quite important, because then I think labeling it in your head as, oh, this is a left wing, a right wing piece of information, and how they talk about the information is important because it makes you understand the social aspect of it. So it's not just going to be about what the news is, what is happening, but how it's being perceived and how it's being understood and consumed by people on the ground. And I think that was one of the things that I wanted to constantly tell myself as well. Oh, okay, so if I'm leaning towards this kind of ideology, for example, or just perspective, then this is the media, or this is the news that I'm consuming, and this is how it's being told to me. So then my way of understanding it and interpreting it is going to be very different from how it's being understood by someone else. So it's not just about reading the news and seeing it as this is how the world works, but also just trying to see how that affects other people as well. And I think that's, to me, more important than just understanding and knowing what's happening in the world.
Interesting. I want to try to look into a specific part of what you just said, with regards to different perspectives or different approaches that different news outlets offer to, let's say, covering a certain event. Do you think that we should take a deliberate effort to diversify, let's say, our sources? For example, The Economist is one, but then we should also take more sources from the left, from the right, because I think in every country there are different media outlets located in different parts of the spectrum. How do we approach that?
Yeah, I agree. I think absolutely try to read from as many and more diversified sources as possible. Hi, Mika, I just saw your message. I'm not exactly sure what the helicopter view method is. Because I wouldn't know if I'm talking about the exact definition or terminology that you're using, but I would say try to see as many things as possible. Try to be as diversified as you can be. But also, it's not just because you're trying to understand how people think, but I think also for your sake as a person. Because if you tend to consume media or news that is already leaning towards what your ideologies are or what your principles and values are, then everything tends to be a bit more biased, and how you view things, for example, become more entrenched. And I think the deeper those thoughts are, and the deeper the convictions are, the harder it is to quite be in a conversation with you as a person, and not just again, any debater, for example. But I think as a person, it becomes harder to engage in a conversation with someone who is just so stern with their views. So to keep an open mind, it's best to read from as many sources as possible, and that helps you not just as a debater or as a as a professional, but I think as a person as well, that's going to be a good thing. So I would suggest yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think I very much agree with that, especially because among the things that I started to reflect upon is among the biggest factors to being a good writer or speaker is to become a good listener and reader, and to take in as many information from as many sources as you can is something probably worth doing. Although, as you said, it's important to also filter out, different, and to be conscious with the information that we receive.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just gonna
Sure.
add something to it. I just thought about it. I think it's also quite important that when you read something, and you understand that this is coming from a completely different point of view, that you don't see it with antagonism. You don't read it and think, oh, but you're wrong, or like you're scouting and scavenging for reasons to say that this person is wrong, or that's exactly why that's not the case, right? So I think you try to be as open about it, and think of and give the credit and merit to what they're saying as much as possible. So I think, yeah, just saying.
Sure, very important point. Let me translate that again to our friends here. Teman-teman, jadi salah satu poin yang tadi disampaikan sama Leslie mengenai bagaimana kita melakukan riset yang baik. Utamanya adalah jauh sebelum kita memulai riset yang spesifik untuk perlombaan tertentu, kita harus memperbanyak bacaan kita, khususnya dari sumber-sumber berita. Salah satu tadi yang disarankan oleh Leslie adalah The Economist. Kalau di Indonesia itu mungkin ada beberapa news outlet yang berhubungan sama ekonomi, itu bisa Tempo mungkin salah satunya, Jakarta Post kalau di Indonesia gitu ya. Dan hal lain yang tadi dikatakan dan kita juga bicarakan adalah bagaimana kita harus memperbanyak sumber referensi kita. Secara sengaja kita harus punya keinginan untuk mencari tahu dari perspektif yang berbeda-beda. Misalkan ada media-media yang mungkin kita tidak setuju dengannya, tapi penting juga untuk tetap kita melihat dan setidaknya mempertimbangkan apa saja hal yang baik yang bisa kita ambil dari sana, bukan hanya dengan prejudice atau kayak kita sudah punya pandangan tertentu, tapi kita juga harus tetap punya pemikiran terbuka terhadap possibilities yang berbeda-beda. Now, Leslie, do you think so? This is one of the most exciting parts about our session today, at least from the perspective of our friends that are joining, is how do you think this skills that you have developed over debating helped you, grow as a person, especially to lead you to where you are now and previously at OHCHR and UNRWA?
Okay, so I think honestly, the way the things kind of played out, I would say really helped me. And I have to be very clear first from the beginning. The way the trajectory of my career has also panned out was in a way quite linear. So I started with debating, and then I went to moot. And then when I did moot, I did submissions specifically on international law. So it was going to be very specific to a certain kind of mooting. Obviously, it's very different if you want to do arbitration, for example. That's going to be another kind of arm. You can do commercial law, but in my case, it was very much directed towards international law, specifically in times of conflict. So I was doing that kind of background already while I was in law school. And even when most people never really had that kind of exposure, I was getting honed at it in one way or another. Like that was a training that I was getting for about 5 years, 4 or 5 years. So, and I remember that when, for example, I started with OHCHR, I started with Myanmar, and my bosses actually really said like, oh, you really stood out because you understood IHL already. And I actually started out as an intern with the OHCHR, and it was a very like specific kind of internship. It wasn't just like an human rights internship. It was a war internship. So they wanted someone to understand IHL. They wanted someone to like was able to know what the context was in general and had like a rather Asian background. So I was very lucky to fit the bill at that point in time. But I think because of one, the linearity of how my life had played out, but more importantly, my ability to discuss things. So when I started as an intern, what happened was they were giving me tasks for a paid person, which essentially means like a regular paid personnel from BU, and I was doing tasks. So I was talking to people on the ground. I was like having consultations, and I think that was one of the things that I really learned was a translation of all the skills that I managed to hone over time. Because then I was talking to a lot of people, I was doing presentations a bit, I was trying to argue my way through things, especially when we would discuss legal frameworks. And I would try to say that this is not how I would say it, or this is not how I would frame the argument, because then it would be too argumentative. And I think if you work for agencies like the UN, where they tend to be very careful with the wording. They tend to be very careful with how sentences, for example, can be construed. So we spend hours just discussing how to say one thing. Like it can be a sentence from a report that we're arguing for, but I think that's important. And I think you really manage to understand that because you get to a point where, for example, in debate, you're very careful how you argue things, because when your opponents are like set out to misconstrue everything you say so that they can make arguments and say that you're wrong, then you get to be very careful and you get to be very aware of how you're saying things. And I think even from that angle, I just kind of honed it. So I was very lucky in that sense, because then I would read the material, for example, like a draft. I would read a draft and it'd be like this, and I would start flagging everything that can be misconstrued. And it's not coming from, say, just reading, for example, but it's coming from years of just being trained and being faced with opponents that will want to misconstrue you every step of the way. So I think because of that, the lesson on clarity, the lesson on being sure that how you deliver things is exactly how you want to say them, then kind of made sense to me over time. So I would say that that was one of the best things I got from the experience, really. Especially when you want to work for these kinds of agencies where wording is very important, impartiality, neutrality, or even the sternness of the language. If you want to say something so unequivocal, then you also learn from that experience. I think that was my takeaway.
Right. I was about to ask, how do you think these skills, in debating, because in debating, of course, the most prominent skill is speaking, right? But then
Yeah.
when it comes to the work that we do on a day-to-day basis in international law, is not always as the person who is speaking.
Yes.
Sometimes we do all of the behind the scene work where you write, you read. How do you think the skills of speaking or basically any of the skills that you do in debating translate to the, those more writing component of
Mhm. I think because speaking has always like a mental aspect to it, where in your head, your ability to write speeches that are moving, for example, translate to how you write. So the way that you can give punches, and I remember this distinctly, not to toot my own horn, but when I would draft reports before, I would think of it as a speech. So when I would draft it, I would think of it as like, oh, how do I deliver a punch? Because the thing is, I think what people forget about speech, like I think how they tend to make a distinction between writing and speaking is that they think they're two very different skills. But what they don't understand, like what I don't think that people kind of remember all the time is that when you read something, you're reading it as if you're delivering the speech in your head. So you're kind of listening to yourself give a speech, right? So the way that you write, for example, makes a difference, because then if you make intonations or pauses, or you make it seem like the sentences are short or the sentences are long, in a way, when a person reads it, they're delivering that speech in their head in a manner at which you want the whole thing to be read and the whole thing to be delivered. So I would say, even if you're not speaking in your own voice, that voice is going to be someone else's, but that's the exact same language and message that you want anyway. So I think that is translated, but also because I feel like it depends from my background. Um, Other than the public speaking, like the kind of work that I did afterwards was very much into writing and reporting. But I also know of people who ended up really in very different fields where it's very front facing, and they do a lot of speeches themselves. And I think that's great. And they really, really got so much from the experience. I would say they got so much better. And I think their ability to actually reach specific professional heights and career heights was very much hinged on their experience as public speakers. So I think that's one of the things that would be obviously a key takeaway. I think your ability to just not be phased when you're speaking before a crowd, just not being afraid of arguing, for example, or talking or trying to make a case. A lot of times you take that for granted, but then you meet so many people who get afraid when they do it, or um, or have that as a concern, and then you realize like, oh, I don't know why I'm not phased, but then you also think, that's because I did that for most of my life, and that's as normal for me as everything else. But then, so like there are things that are obviously a good thing, um, and it's one of the things that I feel like very lucky to have experienced.
Amazing. Let me just translate that to our friends here. So teman-teman, salah satu poin yang tadi ditanyakan adalah bagaimana skills yang dikembangkan selama debat itu bisa dipakai ketika bekerja di konteks profesional, khususnya di bidang hukum internasional. Dan salah satu hal yang penting adalah bagaimana kita bisa menyampaikan argumen itu secara tepat. Jadi bukan hanya panjang, tidak semua yang dikatakan itu harus panjang lebar, tapi juga tepat sasaran dan jelas. Karena ketika debat kita tuh akan sering dilatih bagaimana dilatih oleh lawan lebih tepatnya, bagaimana setiap kata yang mungkin bisa dimisinterpretasikan itu akan diulik atau bisa dikatakan digunakan oleh lawan sebagai landasan untuk menyanggah apa yang kita katakan argumen kita. Dan tadi ketika pertanyaan kedua bertanya mengenai bagaimana skill debat itu akhirnya bisa dipakai dalam konteks kebanyakan pekerjaan itu kan juga yang aspek menulisnya. Sebetulnya dengan kita berpikir bahwa apa yang kita tulis itu akan berubah menjadi semacam speech atau pidato di kepala siapapun yang membaca itu juga membantu kita untuk bisa memastikan bahwa apa yang kita tulis itu betul-betul bisa mengena gitu ya, dalam artian intonasinya pun berasa seperti itu. Leslie, I think to wrap this up before we open the floor for our friends here, because some of them have asked questions, I think it's just appropriate that we give them the opportunity. I'd like to ask two questions. So the first question is that, of course, when we do competitions, there's bound to be occasions where we do not get the result that we want. And I think this can be very hard for some people, for many, and I think even I dare say for everyone who will experience this for the first time. Do you have any advice on how we can bounce back, after experiencing this kind of situation?
Okay, you said two questions, so that's the first one.
Yeah, the first one is basically just as a conclusion. Most of our friends here are in high school or even junior high school, by the way.
What's junior high school?
In Indonesia, junior high school is for grade 7 to 9.
Okay. Right. So like middle school.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
That's like what? Age 12. So some of us are age 12. So what advice do you have for our friends here starting out?
Okay, so I think when you're starting out, especially at such a young age, you tend to be less in control of your emotions. I remember crying a lot before when I was much younger, every time I lost, especially if like you disagree with the call of the judges, and that will happen far more often than you think. You will really just be so frustrated at how you think you had argued something and you had explained something so well, and they just never got your argument for the sake of it and for its full credit. And that's going to be very frustrating. Or if, say, for example, the judge says, oh, but you didn't say this, but you distinctly remember saying something like that or arguing something to that effect. I think as you're young, learn just to be okay with losing. I think losing is a very important part of life. We never always win. My lessons and losses came very early, and I think they really shaped my character, so that in a sense where if I don't get wins now, I'm like, oh, okay, that's okay. maybe next time, like we'll do it next time. But definitely I had my fair share of tears for when I lost and the frustration. But also I think to take accountability for the losses. In so many ways as possible, we come from a position of I wouldn't say pride, maybe, but it's always very hard when you're criticized and you're being told what you failed to do. And I think that's always the feedback that you get after a round, right? Like they don't praise you. They tell you this is what you should have done. I didn't hear this. This is how the argument played out. And so you want to take that for its true value. Be understanding that everything should be constructive, even when they're delivered or said in a way that isn't. Take the bits that will help you and try to learn from that and really just understand that there is merit to what people are saying, even if you disagree with it, and even if it points out a flaw in how you speak or how you deliver an argument. Just listen to it very well and then take it and learn to grow from it. That's second. But also, I think very importantly, and this is one of the things that really helped me, was I remember distinctly we were doing nationals, but I was already in college then. So we were doing nationals. We had lost quite early. I think we lost in the semifinals of nationals. And we were like the top team at that point. We were doing so well. So everyone had kind of expected us to kind of win. It was on a and we lost because I didn't know. It was my fault. Honestly, it was my fault. I remember it was an issue on Saudi Arabia and the oil prices, and I just had absolutely no idea what it was about, which happens a lot. There will be rounds where you have absolutely no idea what it is that you have to argue. And then I lost because I didn't know much about it. So I couldn't argue so much about it as well. And then I started crying so hard. And one of my coaches back then just looked at me and said, "Why are you crying so hard? Like years from now, this wouldn't really even matter. Like what round you lost or what round you won isn't what matters." And I think that's the most important thing. Like when you think about debating, obviously it's nice to win. You get very competitive and you want to do so many things. But what you have to remember is that the takeaway is not the win or the loss. It's the skills that you get to hone in the process. And the wins or the losses are only reflections of how much you've already honed those skills, but
Right.
they're not going to be definitive of how you're going to, or they're not indicative rather of what it's going to look like for you in the years to come. It's like, sure, there are people who end up national champions and they do really well in life, but sometimes there are people who have never won anything and are doing so much better, but that's never going to be the metric. I think it's just really putting yourself in a position where you hone certain skills and then you use them for other things in life. It's just all about really using what you have in your arsenal and figuring out as you go.
Amazing. So let me just translate that one last time to our audience, and then we can proceed with the Q&A. Teman-teman,
Okay.
jadi salah satu hal yang diberikan pesan dari Leslie adalah bagaimana kalau misalnya kita masih muda nih, ketika kita lagi di sekolah atau kuliah, pasti kita punya masalah dengan bagaimana kita menerima kekalahan atau menerima apa yang menjadi feedback atau umpan balik dari orang yang menjadi juri misalkan. Dan penting untuk kita tetap melihat bahwa setiap kegagalan itu atau mungkin kekalahan itu bukan hanya kita gagal, atau bahkan sebenarnya kita harus melihat itu sebagai kesempatan untuk belajar gitu. Karena pada ujungnya bukan kekalahan di perlombaan itu yang menjadi poin utamanya, tapi apa yang bisa kita latih dari sana, apa yang bisa kita belajar dari bahkan ketika ada umpan balik atau masukan yang diberikan secara mungkin kurang enak, kita tetap harus melihat apa yang bisa kita dapatkan dari sana, karena pada akhirnya kan akan ada sesuatu yang bisa kita pelajari dari setiap apa yang kita dengar, dan itu adalah tugas kita juga salah satunya untuk bisa menerima itu dengan baik dan memfilter apa yang memang menjadi masukan dan mana yang bisa dikatakan suara bising yang harus coba kita telaah lebih lanjut. So that's the questions from me, which is a lot. Thank you, Leslie, for answering each and every one of those very well, as usual. So, yeah. So now we open the opportunity for our fans here who might have questions. Feel free to raise your hand, and I'll give the floor to you to speak directly, because I think that's better. Does anyone have any question? Oh, Ezra has a question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Leslie, for gracing our talk today. This is a question from my student who cannot attend this event, but she asked me to
Okay.
ask this to you. Many times, like what you said, we don't know about the topic that we are debating on, and many times we disagree with the motion, but we have to agree, or vice versa. How do you help a 14 years old to have that kind of mindset that is important as a debater? Because as someone who's 14 years old, what she believes is what she says. So saying things that she doesn't believe is something against her will, and she finds it hard. What would you advise to her?
I think maybe the first thing is that in a round, I think, and one of the things that we have to pick up on quite early in life is that there are so many things that we don't want to do and end up doing anyway. And it gets that lesson gets clearer and clearer the older you get, that you just do it anyway. And I think perhaps this is an exercise, just like being forced to argue and discuss something that you don't necessarily like, the standpoint at which you disagree with, and learning that it's possible to start at such an early age and being able to do that would mean that the second you're a lot older, and it's kind of more for yourself really as you grow older, that when you do things, and it's not to say that everything that you do in life just has to not be principled, but it's also understanding that there are just things that you take at face value. Like this is really just training. It's you're not being forced to speak and give a round and then sign something at the end to say, oh, this is your stand on things. It's just words. And I think that maturity of just knowing these are just words, these are just my ability to practice a specific skill. And also just like speaking in a way that tries to force you to be as persuasive as possible over something you don't inherently agree with kind of teaches you to know that there are times in life where you're supposed to deliver that material, but also that when people speak, they don't necessarily mean certain things. And I think that's a lesson that you have to learn quite early on in life, where you understand that not just all the time, like people can have a persona where they speak about something and that's not what they believe in. So that's a lesson not only in professionalism, but also just in life in general. And I think that's one thing. But also, as early as 14, for example, I would say it's good to have the experience of being forced to argue something, because then that means that at such a young age you already have that flexibility and being open. I think when you're forced to argue something that you don't necessarily agree with, it's literally the time when you're forced to view it at its full merit. And I think that in itself is the value of being forced to argue something. And I think to be like understanding that this is what it's supposed to look like then allows you to understand people better when you're having a conversation with them and they actually believe what they're saying, that, and you disagree with it. And I think that's one of the things that you should know, like or obviously this is quite heavy and quite deep for that age, but we try to learn as much as possible over time, and then take it as just like a game, like a sport. Really, the debating is just a sport. Any kind of public speaking is really ultimately it's a sport. It's not as athletic as people would hope for, but it's ultimately a sport. And then if you tell yourself that it's just that, then it shouldn't mean so much. And I think that is a value in and of itself, knowing when things should matter and knowing when knowing when they shouldn't.
Exciting. Yeah, perhaps the next sport in the Olympics would be debating.
Yes.
Okay. Does anyone have any other question? Perhaps Mika or Fatih, who's been very active in the chat, or Raina. Oh, Mika, yes. Let's go.
Hi, Mika.
Hello, and thank you for
Hello.
kesempatan deh. And thank you for the opportunity. And most of debate competition I've taken part of are observation-focused debate, where the arguments are based on common sense, which is without any numeric data. And my question is, how to build a solid argument based on observation in a very short time, and we don't have many experience in that in that apa motion?
Motion.
In that motion, yes. And how do we build a solid rebuttal without panic and combining logical and empiristic style in an argument?
Okay. So I think with respect to the first one, if it's not something that you know about, one, make an effort to make sure that it's not shown. So when you speak, you don't go like, oh, I wouldn't really know. But you have to sound with conviction, like you have to sound like you're speaking with conviction. And I think that comes with the understanding that even if things look very different at their core, they're all the same. So, this is when you start thinking about how people act in general. So if it's not in their best interest and something hurts them, then naturally they will act out a certain way. And that's either going to be positive or negative, and you start painting out these examples. So then you come back to something that you know for sure, like human folly is something that you know for sure will happen, or hard work will happen, or events that are naturally understandable given the logical progression of phenomena. And I think that's important so that even when you don't know something, you can say that, well, this is how it's likely going to happen because it's almost a non-negotiable that if, for example, prices go down, then this is how people will react. Like, very, very normal things in life. And I think you have to develop a skill where you transpose any topic and kind of just like peel the layers to understand that at their core, they're all the same. So then it doesn't really phase you the second you hear emotion and you don't really understand what it's about because you know that in one way or another, the outcomes are going to be similar, or at least in their core, the logic is going to be the same. So that's first. I think when it comes to the second question on rebuttals and how to listen to rebuttals, this was a long time ago, so I wouldn't know if this is still as effective. But one, listen to the argument and then break down the argument that they're saying. So for the most part, most people try to argue against the conclusion of the argument. So if I make a rebuttal, for example, and in my speeches, for example, if I have 7 minutes, I dedicate a huge amount of my time on rebuttals alone. I would say 4 minutes on rebuttals alone, because it's important to be as deconstructive as you are constructive. So I remember when I would deconstruct an argument, I would then think and would like listen to how it's being presented, and then I would look at what is the premise of the argument, what was the rationale behind the argument, and then what was the conclusion that was used. I don't attack the examples used when I'm listening to something, because if you attack the example, you're not essentially attacking the argument itself. You look at the premise of the argument, and then if you can attack the premise of the argument, that would be best. So attack the premise of the argument, because if it's a building block, right? And this is how blocks are built. You take out the premise, which is the foundation of the entire argument, then the whole thing just kind of falls apart. Then I spend less time arguing against it because I've just essentially deconstructed the foundation. But then I would say that start with the premise first. If the premise is correct, then look at the way the argument is built. And naturally, there will be fallacies and illogical missteps in that process. And then you need to be very careful when you listen to them. And then you try to argue against them. Then finally the conclusion. But then I wouldn't really recommend on hitting that bit. So it's always the first parts of the argument. So when a person starts arguing, for example, listen very well to the very first parts of the argument, because most people tend to explain and take time in the latter half, but it's always the first half that's most crucial, I would say.
Interesting. So I think one of the things that you just mentioned them with regards to rebuttal is to be effective, where to strike, like start with the premise, if not possible, then start with the logics in the argumentation. So teman-teman, if there is anyone else, I think we can have one more question and then we should wrap things up. Is anyone? Does anyone want to ask a question? I think Fatih just unmuted yourself a bit. Did you want to ask a question or? All right, if there are none, I think because there was a lot to your answer there, both for Ezer and Mika's question. Let me just translate that to everyone just to be clear. Jadi hal pertama adalah mengenai yang ditanyakan oleh Ezer adalah bagaimana kita bisa bisa berpikir untuk perspektif yang kita sendiri sebetulnya tidak setuju gitu. Nah, salah satu hal yang penting adalah untuk memahami bahwa setiap perspektif itu juga harus kita pahami ada sisi yang bisa kita dalami, dan dari situ kita juga sebetulnya ini menjadi exercise atau latihan untuk kita bisa punya apa ya, pandangan yang lebih luas terhadap dunia, karena di situ akhirnya ketika kita diposisikan untuk berargumentasi mengenai sesuatu yang tidak kita setujui, justru di situ kita lebih terlatih untuk melihat semuanya dari apa yang bisa ditawarkan, dari apa yang menjadi substansinya. Untuk pertanyaan Mika tadi, salah satu hal yang penting adalah bagaimana penting untuk kita bisa memprioritaskan apa yang coba kita sampaikan dalam perdebatan, agar pendapat kita itu atau argumentasi yang kita sampaikan itu secara efektif bisa men-tackle atau membahas apa yang memang menjadi poin pembicaraan. Dan dengan waktu yang memang cukup, kalau kita lihat 7 menit lumayan lama, tapi sebetulnya kalau kita berbicara itu cukup pendek, memang seharusnya kita mencoba untuk memprioritaskan mana yang paling efektif dalam meruntuhkan bangunan argumen yang disusun oleh lawan. If there are no questions, let me check the chat box because everyone is okay. Oh yes, Mika, one more question.
Okay, sorry Kak, I want to ask you one more question. And how about when they gave us a rebuttal, and how do we respond to that and gives a comeback towards them without any panic or even making another spots for them to question us? Thank you.
Okay. I think when you get an attack, for example, in the way that they look at you, one, look at where they're attacking, right? And for the record, just make sure that as much as possible, it's not your premise. If they're attacking an example, then you call it out for what it is. Like, this is an attack on an example. My argument still stands regardless. If they're attacking the logic of the argument, then this is a discussion on propensities. And I would always say, try to argue so naturally, in the greater scheme of things, there's a plethora of possibilities. And if they come in and give you a rebuttal to say, here's one possibility that you did not take into consideration, or it's probably going to be the outcome, then the response should always be about likelihoods. And then it has to be contextualized. So you say, you want to argue why your outcome is more likely than the others, then you also have to contextualize why that outcome is more likely. So then it becomes actually like a constructive part of your speech and not just a rebuttal in itself, because you're trying to build why context is much more important in this case, why it's more likely than the other. And you always have to make an analysis of the best case and the worst case, and why the worst case is more likely or the best case is more likely. What I learned in the years of competitive public speaking is that being comparative is the best way to go about things, because I think most people try to sell an argument, but then the judge does the comparison, right? But if you make an effort to make that comparison all ready for the judge, then the likelihood is that the judge takes that comparison and assesses things from the metrics at which you provided. So then that becomes the important thing, because you're not letting the judge make the discussion or the way that things work in his mind. So then you're leaving it to the judge, right? But then you don't want to do that. So then you create the comparison and you create metrics in the process. What is more likely? What is more possible? What are the circumstances on the ground? How is it going to play out? What is the best case? What is the worst case? Why does this matter? You always ask these questions, and you have to be intentional when you ask these questions. Like, you literally say, why does this matter? You literally will say, why is this more likely? You ask that question to the judge, and the judge picks it up for you.
Awesome. So one word, comparison. So teman-teman, berarti salah satu hal yang penting kalau kita melakukan debat juga adalah bagaimana kita bisa melakukan perbandingan, khususnya karena perbandingan itu adalah sesuatu yang nanti harus dilakukan oleh juri, tapi ketika kita mendapatkan kesempatannya, kita harus melakukan sebisa mungkin melakukan perbandingan itu agar dari juri sendiri mereka merasa bahwa memang logika yang kita berikan adalah logika yang masuk akal dibandingkan dengan lawan. Leslie, I think that's about it in terms of the questions. Do you have any last remarks for our fans?
very good on starting quite early in your life. I think it's a very important skill to have. Um, and also just like investing in yourself and training as much as you can, but also enjoy. Like I think take the time to understand that this is all camaraderie and skill building and finding a sport that you enjoy. So it's a fun process. I think if you do it for a good couple of years, it's going to get funner and funner. But also don't take it as seriously as as possible. Just enjoy the process. It's really going to be one hell of a ride. So yeah, best of luck, everybody.
Awesome. Yes, best of luck, everyone. With that, I conclude my moderating of Leslie. So, Ezra, I'm gonna hand over this for to you for the closing.
Sure thing. So, guys, we have learned a lot from Leslie today, and we believe it's not only learning but also inspiration that we can bring home from this event. To make sure that we remember that we've talked to Leslie, do you mind to open your camera and we can take a screen capture for this event? If you're available to open your camera, it will be great. Misalnya Fatih, Dias, Reina, Day, Mika, if you can open your camera and we can take a picture. If not, I think three of us can also suffice because your names are on the screen and we can capture that as well. Okay, Day is here. Let me change the template. Okay, good. Okay, we can see Day. Dias, bisa buka kamera, Dias? Thank you, Day. Wait, let me add you to the spotlight so that four of us are shown bigger. Okay, on my cue, 1, 2, 3. Sebentar. Do it. Allow me to do it once more. 1, 2, 3. Smile to the camera and still. Awesome. Thank you so much, Leslie. We're blessed to have you. Hope you have a great weekend.
Terima
Wait,
kasih. Bye.
sama-sama, sama-sama.
Thank you,
We're
Leslie.
blessed.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
And thank you everyone for joining this event. See you next time.
Thank you.